Imagine a document, one page, handwritten in faded ink, signed by a man who cannot read his own name. It promises him passage across an ocean, food, shelter, and the possibility of land. In exchange, it takes 7 years of his life. He signs it, or makes his mark, and boards a ship in Bristol or Liverpool, bound for the Chesapeake Bay. He does not know, because no one tells him, that the system waiting on the other side is already designed to keep him at the bottom of it. That is where this story begins, not with the founding fathers, not with the Declaration, with a contract, and the question of who, in colonial America, actually got to own anything, and who never had a chance. Roughly half of all white immigrants to the colonial Chesapeake before 1700 arrived as indentured servants, not pioneers, not freeholders, laborers bound by contract for 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. The indenture system was the economic engine that built the early colonies, and it was built on a very specific kind of desperation. These were not people with options. They were people with one door open, and they walked through it. The terms were written down. At the end of a contract, a servant would receive what were called freedom dues, a suit of clothes, some corn, tools, and in the early years, 50 acres of land. On paper, it sounded like a ladder. In practice, it was a trapdoor. By the late 1600s, the promise of land had largely evaporated. The best land in the tidewater regions of Virginia and Maryland had already been claimed by the men who ran the system. When a servant finished his contract, he stood at the edge of a colony that no longer had room for him. Imagine that moment. You are standing in 1690, newly freed, holding your corn and your suit of clothes. 7 years of your life, gone. You are in your late 20s, possibly older. You have no land, no credit, no political standing. The fields around you belong to the men who just released you from their service, and the law that governs this colony was written by those same men. This was not an oversight. It was arithmetic. The men at the top had a tool called the Headright system. For every person a planter imported into Virginia, whether a servant or an enslaved person, the planter received 50 acres of land. It was presented as an incentive for population growth. What it actually did was concentrate land in the hands of those who already had capital. A wealthy planter who imported dozens of enslaved workers did not just gain their labor, he gained thousands of acres through their very arrival. The bodies of the people he owned became the currency with which he purchased the ground beneath their feet. Tobacco was the commodity that tied all of this together. In the mid-1600s, prices were high enough that even small planters could survive. But in the 1680s, tobacco prices collapsed. Small planters could not absorb the losses. Many lost what little they had. Larger planters with diversified holdings and enslaved workforces absorbed the losses, and then absorbed the land of those who could not hold on. This was the first great consolidation. And when it was over, the landscape of Virginia looked fundamentally different. A small group of families, the Carters, the Byrds, the Fitzhughs, had accumulated landholdings exceeding 100,000 acres, not by working harder than their neighbors, by surviving a price collapse that destroyed everyone below them. In colonial America, land was not merely a place to live. It was the primary store of wealth, the primary source of political power, and the primary mechanism of inheritance. Probate records show that real estate comprised between 50 and 70% of most estates. Land was not a component of wealth. It was wealth. The average colonial farmer typically owned between 50 and 150 acres, enough to feed his family and produce a small surplus for trade. At his death, his estate was valued at roughly 50 to 100 pounds sterling. That was a life's work. That was everything he had built. Now hold that number next to this one. The estate of an elite planter at the top of the colonial wealth pyramid was worth 10,000 pounds or more. The gap between the average farmer and the top of the ladder was not a gap. It was a canyon. Economists measure wealth inequality using a tool called the Gini coefficient, a scale from 0, meaning perfect equality, to 1, meaning one person owns everything. Colonial America's Gini coefficient rose from roughly 0.5 in 1650 to over 0.65 by 1770. The colonies became dramatically more unequal across the very century that produced the rhetoric of liberty. By the mid-1700s, the top 10% of colonists owned roughly 50% of all taxable assets, and by 1770, approximately 5% of colonists controlled 40% of all colonial wealth, held primarily in land and trade. Move north and the story of land distribution was written differently. New England's town grant system allocated land to entire communities in parcels of 100 to 200 acres per family. It produced a more distributed landscape of ownership, structurally different from the vast tract grants that defined the South. The difference between North and South was not cultural, it was institutional. New England's system produced more small freeholders because it was designed to. Southern land policy produced oligarchs because it was designed to. The ideology of rugged individualism did not create these outcomes. Policy choices did. In colonial towns, the skilled tradesman, the carpenter, the blacksmith, the cooper, occupied a middle tier that is often overlooked. These men earned 2 to 3 shillings per day in the mid-1700s, roughly 30 to 50% more than unskilled laborers. That premium over a working life could build something modest but real. The tradesman was not wealthy by any measure that would register in a planter's ledger, but he was not destitute either. He occupied the narrow band of colonial society where dignity and economic stability briefly overlapped, a band that was always narrower than the mythology suggested. Above the tradesman sat the merchant. Philadelphia by the 1760s was the wealthiest city in colonial America, a hub of transatlantic commerce where ambitious men turned ships and cargo into capital. Trade was the engine of a different kind of fortune. A successful urban merchant could accumulate an estate worth 5,000 to 20,000 pounds, putting the best of them on equal footing with smaller plantation owners. A remarkable convergence of two entirely different economic systems, one built on land and enslaved labor, the other on ships and credit. Credit in the colonial world was a two-edged instrument. Merchants extended credit across long chains of trade. Tobacco planters in Virginia owed debts to merchants in London, who owed houses in Amsterdam. When the chain broke, it broke at the weakest link first, and the weakest link was never the man at the top. Return to Virginia. By 1750, the enslaved population of that colony exceeded 100,000 people. These were not footnotes to the colonial economy. They were the colonial economy, at least in the South. Every acre of tobacco planted and harvested moved through their hands. An enslaved person, in the accounting language of the mid-colonial period, was valued at roughly 25 to 50 pounds. This was a capital valuation, the same category of asset as a plow or a barn, entered in the same column of the same ledger. The moral horror of this is not an editorial observation. It is the literal content of the surviving records. George Washington owned more than 8,000 acres in Virginia alone by the time of the Revolution. Thomas Jefferson held roughly 5,000 acres and across his lifetime exercised ownership over more than 600 human beings. These men wrote the documents that defined American liberty. They also held in their hands and their account books the most complete possible refutation of those documents. This is not a paradox that resolves with nuance. It is a contradiction the historical record demands we name clearly. Colonial governors and elite landowners did not simply benefit from the wealth system, they wrote the rules of it. They sat on colonial councils, controlled land grants, and frequently issued those grants to themselves or to allies. The mechanism was not hidden. It operated in the open with legal sanction. This is what made colonial wealth self-reinforcing. Land generated income. Income purchased political influence. Political influence generated more land. The men at the top did not accumulate 100,000 acres by being more industrious. They accumulated it through political access, by converting governmental authority into personal property. In New England, the town grant system created a broad class of small freeholders who could participate in local governance. In the South, that base layer never existed. Political participation and economic participation were both contingent on a land ownership threshold that most colonists could never cross. The unskilled laborer at the bottom earned roughly 1 to 1.5 shillings per day. In a good week, a good month, across a good year, he might accumulate just enough to survive, not enough to save, not enough to buy land, not enough to matter to the men who ran the courts and the land offices. By the time the revolution arrived with its language of natural rights and self-evident truths, the wealth structure of the colonies was already deeply entrenched. The Gini coefficient did not spike at the founding. It had been climbing for over a century. The inequality was not a crisis, it was the baseline. The founding generation knew this. Many of them wrote about it privately, with a clarity they did not deploy in their public documents. John Adams worried openly about the dangers of concentrated wealth to Republican government. The awareness was there. The will to dismantle the system was not. Because dismantling the system would have required dismantling them. Their land. Their enslaved workforces. Their headright accumulations. Their political alliances. The founding was not a failure of imagination. It was a failure of interest. The men who designed the Republic also designed it to protect what they had. Now return to that document. One page of faded ink. The man who signed it, or pressed his mark into it, made the calculation of a desperate person. He traded years of his life for the possibility of a future. The system he entered had already decided before he arrived what kind of future he was permitted to have. Colonial American wealth was not built by self-made men rising through virtue and industry. It was built by a system that moved land, labor, and political power in one direction, upward, and engineered at every level the conditions that kept it there. The mythology of the self-made colonist is not a simplification of this history. It is the opposite of it. The ledgers do not lie. The probate records do not soften the numbers. And the names on the land grants are the same names on the documents we still call foundational. That is not a coincidence. That is the system, working exactly as designed.